Now that we've had a couple of days to digest that Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin interview, we wanted to talk about it a little bit more in depth here. And I was actually talking to a friend of the show who you remember, I think, Yegor Kotkin. He's this cool dude who lives in Moscow, socialist who's on Twitter and all. I love it when we get these kind of people from outside of the U.S. who tangle with Americans here.
Sure.
And it's such a gift of. I hate social media and everything it represents. I wish we could just go back to the 19th century or whatever, but it is such a gift to be able to just get to know people in other countries that you've never been to and may never get to, and allow them to have the ability to kind of engage in the conversation with us. And so I was talking to him about the interview that Tucker had done. He's a fierce critic of both Tucker and Putin.
Right.
So this is not what Blue Anon might suspect when you're thinking about a kind of Russian commentator. But he was actually interviewed, I believe it was yesterday on the program, Left Reckoning, with who's that with? That's Matt Lech and David Griscom. You can go watch his interview over there. But he was flagging a couple of things for me. One, he said it was interesting how frequently Putin went back to Istanbul. And how much he talked about wanting a negotiated end to this war. And people here in the West will say, well, you can't believe anything he says. He's a giant liar.
Yeah.
He can talk about wanting to negotiate an end of the war, but that's just talk. We don't even talk about wanting to negotiate an end of the war.
Yeah. Every time he talks about it, we say it's fake.
We don't even pretend to lie. We are the ones that blew up the first talks. Like, this is a fact. He is the one who launched the invasion. He also talks a lot about, he justifies it and talks a lot about the context around that, so we can talk about that in a second.
And actually, Tucker pushed him he did a pretty good job pushing him on the context that Putin claims induced the invasion.
But Yegor flagged an interesting part in his 30-minute history lesson that he gave Tucker. Tucker, during the interview, clearly thought it was absurd and a distraction. A lot of people made fun of this 30-minute history lesson that Putin just dropped on Tucker after saying that he was going to give him a 30-second to 1 minute history lesson. Side note, we do think it's somehow reasonable to talk about who was living in the Middle East in the 4th century BC when we're talking about a current day conflict. Yet talking about the 9th century, several thousand miles away, is somehow absurd. I think they're both absurd. But what I did want to pull out of his 30-minute history lesson is this brief section where he talks about proto-Ukrainians being angry at the Polish and reaching out to the Russians, asking for their help against the Polish, asking for the Russians to come in basically and absorb this portion of proto-Ukraine into the Russian Empire. Russia not wanting to do it, resisting. This is like the 16th century or whatever he's talking about. Russia not wanting to do it and then eventually doing it. It's starting a war, and then Russia leaving with half of Ukraine as part of Russia. And I think there's some interesting kind of tea leaves that you can read there. So let's play this clip here from Tucker and Putin.
All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights. They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century. Now I will tell you what happened later and give the dates so that there is no confusion. And in 1654, even a bit earlier, the people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow so that Moscow took them away. So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
But still, these are documents from the archives, copies. Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian lands that is now called Ukraine. He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld. And after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later. Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the Pan-Russian Assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar, which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654, a truce was concluded. And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed. And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland.
Okay, so again, if you're listening to that, about halfway through the clip, Putin had an aide give Tucker Carlson a stack of papers.
Yeah. To say, these are the letters sent by the guy in Kyiv to Warsaw and also to Moscow, and then he says they're copies. You know, I'm not giving you the originals.
But no, you couldn't. But for his memory, this is what Putin said. For your memory,
the whole thing is kind of funny. But then you step back and you're like, okay, why is Putin telling this story? Mm-hmm. And Yegor's take, and I think there's some merit to it, is that it's not just a history lesson. It's also a bit of a parable in the sense that. So what's he describing here? He's describing people in Ukraine reaching out to Russia for support against outside elements that are, oppressing them.
Yeah.
That is parallel to what Putin believes happened in 2014 after the Maidan coup. Mm-hmm. So after the Maidan, the war breaks out in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass.
Right.
And the way that Putin describes that is that this was a spontaneous kind of uprising of Russians, of basically Russian-speaking Ukrainians who were reacting against the kind of nationalist, hyper-nationalist Ukrainian elements that took power after 2014 and did do a lot of hyper-nationalist things like crack down on even speaking Russian and otherwise kind of pushing forward this Ukrainian nationalism against these Russian-speaking regions. That's how he tells the story. The U.S. and the Ukrainian nationalists would tell a different story that Putin and the Russians kind of instigated a separatist element in order to destabilize a Ukraine that was increasingly shifting to the West. I think obviously all of those things are true. Mm-hmm. Like whenever you have a separatist movement, there is some organic support for it in the community. There's some historic roots to it, and there are also going to be great powers who are injecting money, arms, and propaganda into it for their own geopolitical purposes. Like that's how these things go. So that's how Putin sees 2014. That Ukrainians reached out to Russia for support, mm-hmm. and Russia provided that support.
Oh, that's how he says he sees 2014.
Right, and that is a parallel with the 17th century, the 1600s story of these Ukrainians reaching out to Russia. And the way he also sees the 2014 thing unfolding, and I think this is what you can draw from his point here, is that at first Russia was reluctant, because he doesn't admit really that this was a kind of Russian separatist-driven operation, even though there were a lot of Russian officers and like Russian figures, who were involved with it. He believes that he was reluctant to get involved militarily, and certainly he was. The military involvement he had from February 2022 on was much more significant and overt than what he had before. So there was hesitation to go and do a full-scale invasion. With Crimea, they just flipped a switch, and all their little soldiers were like, boom, this is ours now, rather than like rolling the tanks in. And so at the conclusion of his parable from the 1600s, Ukraine is split basically in two, down along the Dnieper River, with everything on one side not Russian, and everything on the other side Russian, which sounds like an indication of where Putin sees this ending.
Yeah,
I think that he's going to end up with control of eastern Ukraine, and that's the way he wants this negotiation to end.
And I think that's a really worthwhile point to pull out from this interview, because it does show where Putin could possibly be. You could approach him, or we could approach him, the West could approach him at a negotiating table.
Now, of course, Zelensky's like, we're not giving up these 4 oblasts or Crimea.
Not 1 inch.
Right.
Not 1 inch. And so, again, now we have another clip to roll, too. I do think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. So Sevastopol was literally founded by Catherine the Great. That doesn't mean there was nothing there before Catherine the Great, but modern Sevastopol was founded by Catherine the Great. And this is fast forwarding, obviously, to the 18th century. Putin mentioned Catherine the Great twice in his interview with Tucker Carlson, once right after that last clip cut off. And the reason I think that's important is, does Putin genuinely believe that every breath of this history is fully accurate? I don't know. What I do think, though, is he's very effective at putting a nationalist gloss that he believes in directionally on top of the sort of rationale, because there are strategic and military reasons that these areas are very important. So is Putin and some Russians convincing themselves that these territorial claims are important for nationalistic reasons to justify the importance of the military reasons? You can have a conversation about why the military importance of Sevastopol and Crimea and the Donbass broadly are relevant to Vladimir Putin in the context of NATO expansion. I think that's a perfectly worthwhile conversation. Tucker and Putin got into it. But I think he's very effective. That's a huge takeaway here at justifying the war from that nationalist perspective. And he's gone into these long, extensive histories. He wrote an essay about it that the Kremlin published on their website around the time of the invasion. This is not entirely new, but I think to your point about what could happen at a negotiating table if Zelensky and the sort of Western counterparts can be brought to the negotiating table, I thought that was a useful insight.
Yeah, and we'll go to we'll play him talking about the negotiations next. But to underscore the point you're making, what he was saying throughout the interview, he's asked by Tucker, like, people say, look, after you conquer Ukraine, you're going to conquer Poland and Hungary and Germany and on, and you have this mass territorial expansion. And he argues, no, that would not be in our self-interest. We have no reason to go and do that. And so Tucker says, well, why should anybody believe that? You just invaded Ukraine. And essentially what he's saying is the eastern part of Ukraine asked us to come in, and we came in to protect them. Nobody's asking us to come into Poland. Nobody's asking us to come into Hungary. Nobody's asking us to come into Germany, so we're not going to launch wars of conquest there. And that's where it's relevant to his claim of how credible he believes that claim is.
Yes.
Does he actually think that the Russian-speaking regions here wanted him to come in? This is also
Crimea. Yes.
Yeah, and it's also a piece of rhetoric that all empires use. To this day, if you ask John Kirby why we're in Iraq, he will say we're in there at the invitation of the Iraqi government. So obviously take that with a grain of salt whenever an empire is speaking. But let's roll this. They talked a lot about negotiated end to this war, But let's roll this one particular clip here.
Everybody wanted to resolve the issue by military force only. But we could not let that happen. And the situation got to the point when the Ukrainian side announced, no, we will not do anything. They also started preparing for military action. It was they who started the war in 2014. Our goal is to stop this war. And we did not start this war in 2022. This is an attempt to stop it.
Do you think you've stopped it now? I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification. This means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. This is one of the problems that we discussed during the negotiation process, which ended in Istanbul early this year. And it was not our initiative, because we were told by the Europeans, in particular, that it was necessary to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My counterparts in France and Germany said, how can you imagine them signing a treaty with a gun to their heads? The troops should be pulled back from Kiev. I said, all right. We withdrew the troops from Kiev. As soon as we pulled back our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin and got prepared for a long-standing armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe.
One point there is that describing him moving his voluntarily withdrawing the troops from around Kyiv, that's one way of putting it. The other way of putting it would be they got bogged down in mud and routed unexpectedly by Ukrainian defenses and had to retreat. And one of the points that continues to, or one of the facts of that continues to undermine his point here about Eastern Ukraine is that he was very clearly going for Kyiv.
Yeah.
Like he was going straight there.
Openly. And he's basically, it was the comment is that it was to end the war quickly. Right.
Which, and then I guess, and then the idea that a lot of people have.
It was for them.
Well, yes, you're always that's what liberation is always for. Yes, that's the Iraqi people. And so the idea was that you would then put in what he meant by denazification was going to get rid of the Ukrainian government and put in a puppet government friendly to Russia, and then basically take control of Eastern Ukraine.
Yeah,
like that appears to be the plan as it was hatched. What he was offering at Istanbul was much less than that because he'd been routed in that battle, in those multiple battles. Since then, he has gained significant ground. So what's going to be on the table is probably less than would have been at the time. But still, the idea that Zelensky's going to be able to get all Russian forces off of every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, would require a population of fighters that does not exist anymore because this war has thrown so many hundreds of thousands of men into the meat grinder.
And that's where, from the perspective of NATO and perspective of Ukraine's Western allies, it looks like rewarding Putin for invading Ukraine. Now, he says it was a response. It was purely his literal physical invasion was a defensive maneuver, is what he just called it.
Going to war to end the war. It's nice that all countries engage in the same sort of Orwellian doublespeak as we do. We had to launch the war to end the war. We had to burn the village to save it.
Although even we referred to Iraq as an invasion, ultimately.
No, it was a liberation.
Well, we all refer to Iraq as an invasion, and
you can always apologize for things in the past, but you can never describe them accurately in the present.
But some people don't even apologetically refer to Iraq as an invasion. Right, it's a straight-up invasion for defensive purposes, albeit, but an invasion nonetheless. And when you hear that from Putin, it does, from the perspective of NATO, if we take seriously the arguments of the David Fromms and the Hawks, it does look like rewarding Putin for an invasion. It does look like he, threw all of these men into the meat grinder, all of these civilians into the meat grinder, men and women and children into the meat grinder, and won territory, if that's how this ends. And that is, by the way, the only way that this ends. But again, after reportedly hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides of this war, that is the only way that it ends. You're being unrealistic to say that there's any other way to end this, rather than, as opposed to if you go into years and years of a quagmire stalemate that continues to cost billions of dollars and thousands of lives, or Putin gets part of the Donbass. And Putin seems amenable to taking part of the Donbass, and that would save thousands of lives. And so if you think that, if the argument is that you give Putin part of the Donbass, that he's then going to move into, Poland and Hungary, if that's the argument, you have, I think, a real uphill battle, even though there are legitimate concerns about rewarding somebody for an offensive military operation. And even if you think that they had, so if from a realist perspective, you say, well, what was he supposed to do when NATO was expanding beyond what some people argue NATO said that it would do and promises that it made, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you say that, it's still, you have to contend with whether it's reality that Vladimir Putin now thinks Russia has a historic claim to all of these other parts. In this interview with Tucker, and Tucker pushes him on this, he's really talking about the Donbass.
Right.
They talk about Hungary briefly, actually. I can pull this up in the transcript. Ryan, another thing that I wanted to get, and so Tucker Carlson, by the way, it says, do you believe Hungary has a right to take back its land from Ukraine and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders? And Putin says, I am not sure whether they should go back to the 1654 borders, but given Stalin's time, so-called Stalin's regime, which as many claim saw numerous violations of human rights and violations of the rights of other states, one may say that they could claim back those lands of theirs while having no right to do that. It is at least understandable. Then Tucker says, have you told Viktor Orban that he can have a part of Ukraine? And Putin says, never. I have never told him, not a single time. We have not even had a conversation on that. But I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there wanted to get back their historical land. That exchange to me was arguably the most interesting of the entire interview.
Yeah, the whole thing was pretty instructive. And as you see the way that the U.S. is now kind of, I assume it's going to get through its $60 billion in aid for Ukraine, but the difficulty that it's having getting it through, I think, suggests that that's kind of it. And the fact that Ukraine is running out of manpower anyway, like you can't produce, you can't produce manpower through the U.S. Congress for Ukraine, I think will be a reminder to Ukraine of that Henry Kissinger aphorism where he said, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be its friend is fatal. Mm-hmm. And so Ukraine will join a long list of countries that have worked hand in glove with the United States as part of a U.S. project and wound up the worst for it. To go back to what we were talking about with Istanbul, negotiations were very close to resolving this conflict in a way that would have rewarded Russia for an invasion. Now, Russia would also have been punished internationally through sanctions and through other means of kind of economic deterrence to try to make it clear that, okay, yes, you are 5-10 times bigger than Ukraine, and you have more tanks, and you proved that you can go in and take some of this territory, but it's going to cost you internationally, and so other countries that are planning on doing this should take note of that fact that, okay, yes, it's a fact. If you have more power, more military power, you can, but there are going to be punishments for it. But they were very close to a deal, and the West said no. To turn this down and fight instead, and we will back you to the hilt with endless amounts of weapons. And we did that, but our goal, as we said out loud, out loud we would say that this was about Ukrainian sovereignty. But pretty loudly, we would say this is about weakening Russia. Mm-hmm. That we're trying to drain power from Russia.
And we'd be remiss not to mention that this is all happening. Carlson's interview with Putin is happening. That interview happened literally days before the Senate passed that $60 billion package, $95 billion package, $60 billion of which went to Ukraine. in the U.S. Senate, and that is now pending on the House side, might be dead on arrival on the House side. But another thing that happened this week, Ryan, that I wanted to mention is Senator Kevin Cramer, while we have the Lenin book behind us, tweeted in response to Eric Schmidt, who said nearly every Republican senator under the age of 55 voted no on this America Last bill. 15 out of 17 elected since 2018 voted no. Things are changing, just not fast enough. Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota replied to that tweet and said, "Youthful naivete is bliss. The wisdom of age may save the West. Reagan may be dead, but his doctrines saved the world during less dangerous times than these. If the modern Marx, parentheses, Putin for the youngsters, restores the USSR while we pretend it's not our problem, God help us. Be free." Just so many layers of stupid in one tweet. J.D. Vance responded, "I like Kevin, but come on, man, have some self-awareness. The fruits of this generation in American leadership is quagmire in Afghanistan, war in Iraq under false pretenses, declining life expectancy, and demographic collapse in the West. This moment calls for many things, but boomer neoconservatism is not among them. Hysterically, look at what the neocons wrote about Reagan in the 1980s. They accused him of accommodating the Soviets instead of starting a war with them. Reagan's wisdom applies in 2024, looks very different than what today's neoconservatives pretend." And Ryan, that's a very legitimate point, because Reagan was criticized hard by neoconservatives in the 1980s for being overly accommodating to the Soviets, for being, and Reagan was terrified of nuclear conflict. The movie, what was the cheesy made-for-TV movie called? About what the day after, is that what it was called? Reagan was very moved by that movie and sort of famously,
I'm glad.
Like kept up at night by the prospect of nuclear war, and was criticized very heavily by neoconservatives, even though we sort of forget about that at the time. And one thing I wanted to ask you about is this idea of Putin as the modern Marx. When Putin is very critical in that interview of Stalin, he's been very critical of Lenin. One of the things he's most critical about is Lenin allowing Ukraine to be carved out of the USSR and secede on Lenin's terms in a way they thought would ultimately be helpful at the time. So to call Putin the modern Marx for so many different reasons is idiotic, but it does speak to this Cold War hysteria that still burns in the hearts of these boomer neocons.
It's the only way they can understand the world.
It's outrageous.
Yeah, it's completely bizarre. Putin's father or grandfather was Lenin's cook. That's the closest connection we have.
It's sort of like how Prigozhin was his cook.
I think it was his actual cook.
You got to watch The Cooks.
And he's named after him, Vladimir.
You got to watch The Cooks.
Yeah.
But again, this idea that Putin is on some sort of Marxist tear to restore the USSR.
He did call it a tragedy, and he's not wrong.
How do you mean?
He said the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the world's greatest tragedies.
He's not wrong.
Yeah, look at the world since then. The world is just falling apart, and it also unleashed the United States. The USSR at least had the U.S. on a bit of a leash. You took that leash off, and we've just been adventuring all over the world and killing millions of people since then.
It's a much better argument to say that Putin is a sort of neo-Russian imperialist than, and obviously there were imperialist desires of the Soviet Union that I think get erased sometimes when we look back at it now, but it's a much better argument to say that he wants to restore the sort of czarist Russian empire than to say that he's the modern Marx, who's like this international Marxist, even though he's openly very critical of some of these Soviet heroes like Lenin. It's just absurd.
But
this is who's running the country.
What I mean also is the Soviet Union by the 1990 was not, that's not Stalin's.
Right.
Just like the United States in 1990 was not United States in 1850, running a slave state, a slave empire.
But people who think that Vladimir Putin is the modern Marx are the ones that are running our foreign policy, so that's comforting.
It was his grandfather who was the personal chef to Lenin and Stalin.
Amazing. That is an interesting little fact.
Spiridon Ivanovich Putin.
There you go. Well, this has been a long tour of Russian history.
There you go.
So I think all we can say is you're welcome.
You got it. Stick around. We'll have more after this.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.